Hello and welcome to Planet Poetry. I'm Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. And this week we interview up-and-coming US poet Ashanti Anderson.
We also have a chat about what we've been reading. Peter's been rediscovering a first full collection that was worth persevering with. And I've discovered Scottish poet George Mackay Brown thanks to a wonderful tribute issue of the Dark Horse magazine. But first, let's hear Peter's interview with Ashanti Anderson.
Ashanti Anderson is a black, queer, disabled poet, screenwriter and playwright. Her debut poetry collection, Black Under, won the Spring 2020 Black River Chapbook competition at Black Lawrence Press. Her poems have appeared in World Literature Today, Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere in print and on the web. So, hi Ashanti, how are you? And thanks for joining us on Planet Poetry.
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Our podcast is called Planet Poetry, so where on this planet are you currently being?
Yeah, I'm in the United States. I'm currently in New Orleans, Louisiana.
I've never been to New Orleans.
The jazz, the music, the history, the culture, the food. It's an amazing place, but also there is that legacy too of, frankly, disaster, natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina was 16 years ago. We recently had another big storm. So this is something, like, as much as the world changes, New Orleans definitely holds on to everything it's known for.
It seems to be a place where loads of things happen.
For sure.
So I think because many of our listeners won't know your work, it would be really good to kick off with maybe the first poem in your chapbook.
Yeah, of course. And this is one of my faves. So I'm excited to share this with you. The first poem in the chapbook is called Ode to Black Skin. You are dark as religion. Remember, God could not have named a modicum of light without you. You are plum, black currant, passion, fruit in another woman's garden. You are black as and as if by magic. Black, not a sin, but a cave's jaw clamped shut by forgiveness. Color of closed wombs and bellies of ships. You, dark as not the tree trunk, but its every cleft. I chart each crescent moon rising above fingernail and rub together my thighs for want of you. I try to find you where the pages of books meet. You hang where men or piano keys segregate. When I miss you, I remember the hickey the sun left on the back of my neck. If I forget, I smoke blunts down to my fingertips and beg you to come on my lips. This is how I pray for you when I'm not pessimistic. I bow to your darkness like I kneel beside a child's bed, confessing as gospel. There's no monster here.
I just love the sort of beautiful lyricism of that poem. It's just an absolute celebration of black skin.
Yes, I wanted the entire poem to be a celebration specifically of darker black skin. Of course, racism against black folks or people with brown or black skin is prevalent worldwide, but even within that, folks with darker skin tones have an even harder time, So I sought to write a poem that really celebrated that darker complexion, to take, if it's only for a page, just to take a moment out of folks' life to say, here you are loved, you are welcome, you are celebrated.
I love that sort of payoff at the end where you say there's no monster here. This idea that there's nothing to be afraid of or to be ashamed of. That reminds me a bit of Leopold Sédar Senghor, who's a Senegalese poet. But that kind of lyricism and that absolute affirmation of blackness is such a beautiful thing. I'd like to explore how your identity as a black, queer, disabled poet How do you find those intersecting kind of identities are played out in your writing and your life?
Particularly as a Black American who has no documentation of my family or my origins beyond maybe 3 generations. I'm also putting it out there as sort of building my own legacy, so to speak. Like I
Mm-hmm.
noticed, in the introduction, and I introduced myself that way as well, as a Black, queer, disabled poet. And that's because I want people to be able to find me. Generations
Mm.
down the line, I want for other Black folks or other queer folks or other disabled folks or other Black, queer, disabled folks to be able to say, like, oh, look at Ashanti. Like, this was a person who was doing this in 2021. And really trying to create that archive in absence of, because one doesn't currently exist for me by design.
Does it feel like you're having to represent lots of other people rather than just write as yourself as an individual?
That pressure definitely exists, but I've taken a lot of steps to release that pressure from
Mm.
myself. When
Good.
I first started writing poetry, I definitely did feel that way. I felt like every poem had to be overtly political, it had to be about social justice, I had to be commenting on, something that was going on in America and how it was wrong and how it should change. And it was a lot of pressure. And I got to a point where I realized, frankly, that it wasn't rewarding to write from that space of feeling like I had to advocate, of feeling like I had to do this kind of work. And instead, I shifted to what are the poems that are actually going to make me happy. And that's where Ode to Black Skin comes from, for
Yeah.
example. It comes from a place of I'm not trying to show other folks celebrate Black skin, love us. I'm not telling anyone to do that. Whether you
Mm.
do or not is your business. I've decided that this is a poem for me to remember how much I love Black skin, and other people are welcome to witness that and participate in it. But I've done the work to release that hold, because it definitely does exist, and I definitely understand and empathize with any Black writers or writers of color who feel that way, or even from any demographic, if you feel like you have to represent, because that's something we are often, it's not stated, but it's definitely something that is kind of, you hear it in the comments when people come to you after the readings and are like,
Yeah.
oh, you should write about that, or oh, this made me think about that. But at the end of the day, it's exhausting. It's not conducive to a long, healthy writing career. So I just had to let it go personally.
It seems to me one of the characteristics of the work in Black Under is the way that you have of bringing the past alive in a way that seemed particularly fresh and contemporary. In one poem, you're drawing historical parallels. You mentioned Lady Godiva and Sandra Bland, who was somebody pulled over by a state trooper in 2015 and humiliated, and then died a few days later. One of those terrible modern American stories, but kind of linked to Lady Godiva. I think your poem "Slave Ship Haibon" is another example of being in two times simultaneously. Could you read us that one, please?
Yeah, sure. Slave Ship Haibun. One day, a descendant of ours will go on a carnival cruise and still find time to think of us. She will hear the boom hiss of a house mix, but think it is impossible to be at peace without understanding it. She will stare down a wave, study its dance moves, note the direction it takes depends solely on the angle of her own glance. And she will wonder, is that the most profound thing she might learn about water? She will crawl under the bed in an attempt to imagine how we once felt, then curse at having too much space to move. At 6:30 in the morning, she will spill a bowl of grits on the liquor-soaked deck and eat the cold, bleached cornmeal with her hands. She will ponder disease. She will envisage death. And she will speculate. The gulls must have stepped near us to pluck between planks for grain as they do now. But she thinks not of how we watch the birds circle overhead, bomb beak first into the ocean. Each in our own way, we began to imitate. A few of us induced feathers. I plucked a plume, made a quill. Crabs scratch backs, claw steel, pale. One's back to another is a ladder home.
I just love that kind of sense of, looking back on the past and imagining people in the past thinking of the future, and that sense of many times at the same time. I think that's lovely. And each in our own way, we began to imitate. A few of us induced feathers. I plucked a plume, made a quill. You're drawing such optimism out of something that's so historically appalling, a real plus out of, being able to transform that experience. Was there anything in particular that drew you to that form? Did it start off as a haibun?
The thing that really stuck to me about it was that as a form, it was often one that was turned to when the poets were traveling or were writing about traveling.
Yeah.
And I wanted to definitely keep in mind that this is a poem that represents some kind of movement. You reach a destination, which is the goal for most poetry, I think. But wanted to also literally be in some form of transit. And honestly, the first thing that came to mind was my ancestors, and of course, me having not been there. I think I don't know if reincarnation exists, but just bearing in mind that if they could see me, because these are things that really happened. I guess I should also say I don't think I've ever I've ever told anyone that, but that's real. I didn't eat grits off the ground of the floor of a Carnival cruise ship, but I definitely did go on a cruise a few years back, and I definitely took in the space, and I was like, wow, like this is cramped, but also not as cramped as it would have been 400 years ago, so
yeah.
So these are thoughts that were already in my mind. So when this form came up and it was very related to traveling, I just really put myself in that space and tried to think like, what would my ancestors think if they saw me complaining about the confines of a cruise ship? And it really just turned into what I think is I try not to brag on myself too much, but I am very happy that in general, in Black Under, I am able to take things that are, horrific and find that beauty within them. I think the shame is overdone, and the centering being on the violence and the horror. I'm past that. I'm honestly, because that's damaging, for that to be the legacy, right? And I want instead to think about the ways in which maybe they thought about the future, maybe they found joy in something, maybe they looked at the birds flying and it gave them a thirst for freedom. And that's something I kind of always try to do, to not stay rooted in the horror, but to find that strength and that joy, or that aspiration beyond it.
In the times we've just been through with, COVID and so on, it's been pretty relentlessly grim. But I'm not suggesting there's a parallel with, the appalling slave trade and so on. But that sense in which, everybody's supposed to be having a terrible time. But, there are moments in any kind of bleak experience where you do look up and your attention is drawn by something beautiful or caught by some bird flying or something. Yes, can I ask you to read earnest prayer? This is another act of transformation that you're doing here.
Answer to an earnest prayer. True, I don't make mistakes. But I was trapped in a man's body 33 years, and I killed myself. Signed, God.
I just love that. That's just a kind of a real put down. It's one of those thing that you wish you could come up with when somebody is like force feeding you unpleasant opinions. And one of the reasons I'm really enjoying your collection is the innovative setup for the poems. There's one is like a job application form where you're inviting the reader to make art of the deaths you witnessed. But the setup for the poem I'm going to ask you to read now, Busts of the Beheaded, is, absolutely exceptional. Can you read that for us, please?
Bust of the Beheaded. It is rumored that the human brain remains conscious several seconds after being decapitated from the body. Penny, beheaded after becoming infected with worms from eating soil to supplement her meager rations. They say sickness come from my back tooth holding mud in its trenches. They say me I got worms, just make me laugh. No, nothing live inside me won't be soon to bury itself, scooping handfuls of hunger over its own head. And even if it grows 3 seasons, it fall one day out my belly and get snatched by traitors who say me I don't have time to mother. So I beat the names of my 9 gone cheering in the dirt with this here shovel. Then I shovel this here dirt with my mouth, nurse clay in my jaw because the grits wasn't enough. My okra seeds dried up and oysters don't fuck fast as we shuck, so I don't believe no worms come inside me. They must can see my waggling finger beds to be envy, read these dusted lips as want. So if a doctor say me I have worms, I eat more worms. And when they say me going crazy, I open wide and say them, look here, this bubbled mouth ain't a sick, it's a cure. Leroy, beheaded for running away to be with his lover. For you, I run past ivy, iron, hound's maw, and high water. Find another man's field for where we might twine legs like snakes and bad suggestions. Let us sip skin salt till our lips feel like our bronzed heels and our steel toes have feeling in them again, till my breath stinks of daffodil milk, till you have followed my constellation of limbs to horizon. This spine of mine has never held wicker basket nor whip, so it'd be easy for me to think every groan spiritual, every stroke the strike of pickaxe into good ground. I envy the ugly, how gravity nibbles the corners of your lips, unpaid labor tugging on your shoulders each sunrise. I do my best to imitate, bent and open like the shotgun loading, like the half-bidden moon, like misread scripture, like your arched and aching back, the grooves wide enough for my fingertips to ride your river of flesh.
I mean, literally, these are the last thoughts of a decapitated person, and just as a setup, the urgency that builds into the work is absolutely inspired. I mean, where did that idea come from?
I was just down one of my little Google rabbit holes and happened upon this fun fact. And I guess there's cases of this happening in the past where folks have been beheaded and like people have seen them blinking or they start to blush. And I became interested in thinking about what a person might think about during those last moments where literally your head is not on your body. um, Particularly a Black person, of course, because I think that's a context that we don't often think about beheadings. We think about so many other tortures that were endured during that era, but beheading specifically, at least for me, isn't one that immediately came to mind, but one that I also did a little searching, and I'm like, okay, this certainly happened. So, yeah, just bearing in mind, like, okay, under what circumstances would a person be beheaded, and then related to that, what would be their final thoughts?
Well, I think it's just extraordinary. I mean, I've never read anything like that. I mean, it's just one of the many unexpected delights of this collection. As a black person writing in America, a young black person, are there signs of hope? You know, for example, Amanda Gorman. You know, what was that a big deal for you, or was that kind of tokenism, or how did you feel about that?
To be honest, and this is no shade at all to Amanda, I appreciate her as a poet. I do appreciate her being there and reading at the inauguration. She's a poet who, I mean, it's well deserved, young, but definitely on a roll. I do appreciate the conversations that started, the folks who became interested in poetry, seeing, oh, this is poetry too. This is poetry that speaks to me. And now
Yeah.
I want to read more poetry like that. When I think about poetry in America, I do think that for folks coming in, starting to read more poetry, I think it's an excellent time to do so. There are poets like myself who are getting away, I think, from feeling this obligatory sense of needing to represent, and are writing towards things that actually fancy them. And I think that's a great place to be in the history of literature, when folks start saying what they really want to. A Toni Morrison quote that I love, and probably repeated to myself once a day is that the very serious function of racism is that of distraction. So I think that when we finally get past being distracted by racism and feeling that we have to prove something, and start actually writing those things that come from the heart, that's a beautiful time and place to be. And I really do think that that's what's picking up currently in poetry, and I'm excited for it, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Ashanti, you're making me feel good and positive about all kinds of things. That's great. I'd like to ask you to read your last poem, which is Self-Portrait as an Overseer.
This is a deep one for me. Self-portrait as overseer. Imagine a 10-year-old with a whip. In films, it's always a middle-aged man with a haggard mouth. I also lost teeth, myself a little snaggletooth falsetto swearer. Movies never show how slaves pissed and shit themselves, but I've seen surrender embrace a brother's tense thighs, sheltered nostrils from the whispered stench of the body's final prayer. The sobbing, not as despairing as his mouth, silent and open for eons before throat unbuttons its sound. Leather makes sculpture of skin. Cotton still lashes my hand, however soft. I'll give you something to cry for. In photos, the overseer's clothes never quite fit, hang over weighted bones like a father's old coat.
Wow. I find that quite a complex and intriguing poem. I mean, there seems to be kind of empathy there, and the idea that the overseer's clothes never quite fit, as if the role and that they've been ascribed never quite has been accepted, or never quite fits. It seems to be very emotionally charged. What was driving you when you wrote that?
Yeah, for sure. It is. It is an emotional poem. For me, of course, as a self portrait, right? So to put
Yeah.
myself in this position as overseer. But yeah, you're spot on, this idea that because the overseer is often the person who is the one carrying out the violence, but the clothes don't fit. They weren't meant for this person. This is a task that maybe they were given, or maybe they felt like they had to, and for whatever reasons, they went along with it. But this idea that, I don't know, that the person who hurt you isn't always, sometimes they are hurting. And that's kind of, I don't know, this is kind of my my make amends poem for anyone that I've hurt, in terms of like acknowledging that, I played a direct part in this violence, and also these weren't my clothes. This wasn't something that I should have been doing. This is something that was kind of put on me. And I think that's something that can be said for a lot of folks. I mean, even when we think about, I don't want to get too political, but even as an example, there can be a lot of, race-based animosity, and sitting back and realizing that, it's not necessarily the person sitting across from you or on the other side of the fence from you that's the real enemy, so to speak. Like, yes, they are violent, yes, they are hurting you, but also, if you look carefully, you see this person is probably a placeholder from the person who's really behind that violence, especially when you think about it institutionally and structurally. I hate to say it, but a lot of folks who are violent and enacting violence are really pawns. And I mean that in the kindest way I can. I know a lot of people say pawns, it's like sheep or, mindless lackeys, but I really mean it in terms of like somebody has to do the dirty work, right? And that's the overseer. But the overseer does not own the plantation. So I kind of drew that metaphor, once again, going back to the past, but still thinking about it in the present, in my personal life and in society at large, in terms of grappling with that, with the individual, but also the grand scheme of things, and finding space to forgive myself for the ways I was influenced to be a negative person, and also finding space to forgive others who have been negative or violent, but were maybe acting on the behalf of other forces. So it is emotional, and it really comes from a place of healing.
Well, Ashanti, in my opinion, I think you're a marvelous writer, but what distinguishes you is that beautiful empathy you have. And so I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Planet Poetry. And I'm going to be looking out for your progress with great interest.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy chatting with you. And yeah, keep in touch.
Okay.
Wasn't that a refreshing interview? I don't know Ashanti's work. I absolutely loved her poems. And I have to say, it was not what I was expecting. I think it just shows, I had to check my prejudices, I suppose, in the sense of what I thought, because she described herself straight away in terms I thought, oh, this kind of, she's putting herself in a box. But actually, it's a complete opposite of that, isn't it?
I love the idea about, those kind of intersectional labels being there as a useful tool for other people to be able to find you in the future. And
yeah. She talks about the fact that she thought early on that she ought to be writing about social, political issues. But she decided for her that wasn't rewarding, and it really wasn't the direction she wanted to go. And that was really fascinating as well.
The danger with writing politically is that, everybody knows where the poem's going to end up, with, an affirmation of the viewpoint of what you think is correct. But her politics shines through what she's doing, but the politics informs it. It's not what it's about. And makes it all the richer for that.
Absolutely. I mean, she's got so many wonderful turns of phrase. I mean, right from that first poem, you hang where men or piano keys segregate, and there's just one image after another there that is very clever and nuanced, and I was gripped by it.
I just felt really uplifted as well, because that perhaps from our, UK standpoint, it just means such a difficult time with Black Lives Matter. It's a time of ferment and change, but, she's a really positive and empathetic voice.
Definitely, yeah.
And that just felt like such a sort of beacon of hope.
I agree that it's celebratory. I mean, I loved it when she said, she's very pleased as she can find beauty within the horrific, and the fact that she felt that actually it's damaging for the horror of the past to be the legacy going forward. Don't stay rooted in the horror. And I just thought, wow, that is such a, as you say, it's affirming.
It's old school alchemy type ideas, isn't it? Turning, all that horrible, dull base metal of those ghastly experiences into sort of lyrical gold, as it were.
Yeah, completely. Yes, that slave ship Highburn. I mean, that was amazing, really. And you asked, what drew her to the Highburn. I just thought this idea that she wanted to have the sense of transit and movement, really, really interesting.
Really considered, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I actually had to look up what a Highburn was.
Well, I did know, because the Hastings stanza that I go to, one of the poets there, she writes Highburn. So we've talked a bit about that in that group. So yeah.
So that's
I could picture
like
it.
A prose poem, rounded off by a haiku at the end of it.
Yeah.
When I looked it up, it was saying Basho was the sort of pioneer in that. And this idea about travelling as well, because he essentially spent his life sort of wandering around in Japan. There's lots of little... I stayed in a small town that had a Basho hut in it where he was supposed to have stayed.
Did you?
Which I went to see, and it's by a briskly running stream. It's all very Japanese and beautiful.
Oh, lovely.
Actually, that form was born out of travelling, and she had it spot on that, her poem was about journeys made in the past and now. Brainy, that Ashanti. I was extremely impressed by her.
I think so. And also, you and I have talked about how there are thousands and thousands of poets in the United States that we just never hear of here. And it's just nice to talk to someone who, not one of the usual suspects, let's say.
Yeah. For me, it was like maybe taking the temperature of, American poetry in a slightly different way. I mean, we spoke to, say, Leanne Howe a while ago, and that was fascinating. She had her own story, but she's very well established. And to get a much younger poet's experience is, maybe what we're all about on Planet Poetry. It's
I think so. Yeah.
We're trying to break out of our little ivory towers in the south of England.
We are.
And swarm around the globe. Okay, Robin, it's that time of the podcast when we quiz each other on what we've been reading. Have you done your homework? Have you read anything interesting?
Yes, sir, I've done my homework.
Oh, that's good.
I've actually, this book, I'm calling it a book. It's a magazine, The Dark Horse, a long-established Scottish magazine. I subscribed to it at the beginning of this year, I think, or possibly last year. And it's always a pleasure when this comes through the letterbox. So when the autumn-winter issue arrived, on the cover, it says...
Canter.
It did. Clip-clop. George Mackay Brown, 1921 to 1996, a centenary issue. So I, in my ignorance, I'd never heard of George Mackay Brown. There's a fantastic drawing of him on the cover, this characterful head with this lantern jaw. And I just thought, gosh, who is George Mackay Brown? And it's a fabulous issue. I've been completely absorbed by it. And the foreword by the editor, Jerry Cambridge, explains how he knew George Mackay Brown. He was an early collaborator when he started the magazine, The Dark Horse. And it goes on to showcase there are essays from people who knew him, people who published him, who collaborated with him. And we've got some of his letters reproduced. And it's just a fond remembrance of this man who is clearly an exceptional and very interesting person. He basically lived his whole life on the island of Orkney. And he had tuberculosis when he was quite young, and so his health kind of limited his travel. But nevertheless, he was very well known in Scotland, apparently. He wrote poetry, plays and fiction, and many of his poems are sort of saga-like. He was very much rooted in the landscape of Orkney and the history and religion. He was a late convert to Catholicism. So Saint Magnus, I think it is, who's the patron saint of Orkney, appears in his work. And I've really enjoyed reading about him and reading some of his poems. And there are also poems in the issue. It's not all essays. There are poems by him, and there are also poems by other poets who are responding to him. Either they knew him or they're contemporary poets who are responding to his work. And it's a wonderful book. I'm going to be reading it for some time, I think. Also, a very interesting essay by Edna Longley on prose poetry and the line, etc. Yes, exactly. So that was rather interesting as well.
Are you going to read one of George's poems?
Yes. This is one section from a 7-part sequence. And I suppose this illustrates this idea of some of his poems are like mini sagas. And this is called Havard, 7 choruses. So there's this character, Havard, and each chorus is people who knew this character through his life. So you have the islanders and how they perceived this character. He was a bit of a loner and a bit different. Then there's girls, and then sailors. He went away and became a sailor. And then there's the seabirds commenting on him, which is lovely. And then number 5 is old women. So these are the old women discussing Havard after his death. Old women. Not much to lay out here, a skull and a few bones. Havard is lost in brightness. Death beyond love lays bare to the skeleton. Wash the knuckle. The hawk had more anger. Wash the rib. The dog was as good as love. Wash the shin bone. The stallion drank a cleaner wind than him. We lay these fragments in the long, intricate order of man. Lay the silver brooch on the breastbone. Put by the water now and the cloths. The priests are at the door with candles.
Oh, how nice is that?
Oh, really nice.
That makes me, that sort of makes me think of the sort of Middle Ages somehow, and all those kind of legends and the idea that it's ended with the priests at the door. I mean, that's a totally timeless kind of poem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, elsewhere in the magazine, somebody talks about the fact that he didn't really use the incidents of his own life in his poetry, in contrast to today, where there's a huge amount of autobiographical content in people's work, I suppose.
Yeah.
And he was drawn more to his surroundings and the history of where he was and the ecology of the place and the creatures. And I guess, yes, the suggestion was that he didn't see his own life, his own experiences as the poetry that he wanted to write.
Lovely to be remembered and marked that way in a magazine of that kind of quality.
I think so, yeah.
Gosh,
I think so that's my reading material at the moment. I would like to hear what you've been managing to read. I know you've been very busy with work, but you've been chilling out with some poetry.
Yeah, no, I've actually had a chance recently to do a lot of reading, so I've really enjoyed that.
Good.
First of all, I need to confess, one of my worst faults is that I take instant dislikes to something. And my line on this is that I like to take an instant dislike because it saves time. I find it works really well when you're in art galleries and you've only, there's...
Yeah, I've only got to look through the door of a room sometimes and say, right, I'm not going in that one.
Well, I did this with this book I've been really enjoying. It's called The Perseverance by Raymond Antrobus.
Oh, yes.
And I picked it up a couple of years ago and had looked somewhere in the middle and read a poem and thought, nothing to see here, and chucked it aside. And then 2 years pass, and then I pick it up again and find that I'm really enjoying it. And, unlike the George Mackay Brown that we were talking about, that, this is definitely very autobiographical. Mm-hmm. And one of the strands is about deafness. And I kind of learned from the notes that people who have deafness from an early childhood are deaf with a capital D, while older folks that may get hard of hearing are deaf with a lowercase d, because that's just a medical thing and hasn't really shaped their identity as people who have had, hearing problems as babies or whatever.
Right, that's interesting.
So, he's deaf with a D, a capital D. He also has a dual English and Jamaican heritage. So he writes about both those things, but it sort of leads to kind of deeper concerns about, what it is to be heard and to be misinterpreted and underestimated. And there's kind of poems about his own physical appearance, for example, and where that locates him racially. Like there's poems about his kind of texture of hair and so on, and what that implies for, how he belongs to in the community, particularly the black community in these poems. Really interestingly, perhaps, quite controversially, there's even a redacted poem in it called Deaf School by Ted Hughes. And actually, Ted Hughes wrote a poem called Deaf School. But in this book, there's 2 pages with just thick black lines of redaction, and the whole poem is redacted.
Yeah.
And so I kind of ferreted out the poem it talks about. Ted Hughes talks about children lacking a dimension.
Oh.
And it's kind of these deaf children. I think it's fair to say this isn't one of Ted's finest hours.
Dear.
But I thought that's quite provocative and quite challenging to have another writer's work in your book and then just kind of cross the whole thing out.
I wonder if he had to get permission to reproduce it, and then he actually didn't reproduce it. That's
yeah.
quite a statement.
To think. Yeah, I think the poem has got fewer lines in the redacted version.
Interesting way to make a point. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, it's got interesting notes in the back, and he quotes this academic called Jennifer Esmail, saying the root of oppression for deaf people is being forced to speak. So, yeah, it's kind of challenged a lot of my, I found it quite provocative and interesting. And the fact all these strands hang together really richly and very readably. And one of them, maybe the thing that unifies them, a lot of the poems are about his father, who's just fairly recently passed. And, the universal thing about it is there's a lot of celebration of those mixed feelings you have for people that you love. Unlike deafness and things, this is the absolute, everybody feels those things. So I thought I'd read the poem called The Perseverance. And it turns out, as you read the poem, that the Perseverance is the name of a pub. And there's a quote from Peter Tosh as a starting point. Peter Tosh was in the original Wailers with Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer.
Oh, yeah.
And had quite a big career of his own, including the famous Legalize It and various other things. Anyway, we won't go into reggae. But Peter Tosh's quote is, "Love is the man overstanding." And this is the poem, The Perseverance. I wait outside the Perseverance, just popping in here a minute. I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father, watch him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the Perseverance, until everything disappears. I'm outside, counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We've been here before. No such thing as too much laughter unless you're my mother, without my father. Working weekends while the perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the perseverance while strangers ask, "Where is your father?" I stare at the doors and say, "My father is working." Strangers who don't disappear but hug me for my perseverance. Dad said this will be the last time before. While the TV spilled canned laughter, us on the sofa in his council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil, any minute I will eat again with my father, who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before, overstanding our heat and perseverance. I still hear, popping in for a minute, see him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it. I am still outside the perseverance, listening for the laughter.
Oh, gosh, I love that. And the repetition of the perseverance in a different context as well. And the boy always waiting and disappear like a coin in a parking meter, wasn't it?
Yeah, fantastic. That's fab, isn't it? And there's many of us who have sat outside pubs.
It certainly evokes that period when pubs were just places where children didn't go and they were full of smoke and the smell of booze. And
the book is, very human and kind of is a powerful personality holding it all together. And just a really good read as a poetry book. And I think that's not to be underestimated. Excellent. The whole collection really hangs together.
Yeah, excellent. Good recommendation. Who's it published by?
It's published by Penned in the Margins.
Ah, fine small press. Peter, do you remember the year 2000, the early days of the World Wide Web, before Google, before Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, I do. At the time, I was working for IBM.
Oh, indeed, were you? And what were you doing there?
I was writing letters to people, warning them about the dangers of Y2K for about 2 years. And before that, extolling the virtues of this newfangled internet thing.
Yes, weren't we all?
Getting people to invest in computers and systems and so on.
Were you doing that for a living, or did you believe? Were you a believer?
Oh, no, it's entirely for a living.
I mean, I had this sort of romantic introduction to the web, I think. I was a real kind of believer in this fabulous future that it was going to mean for everyone. And I was just noodling about in academia, discussing, what's this going to mean for the media? What's this going to mean for information and access to and all the rest of it? Anyway, that's sort of by the by, really. But something I've always believed in is that with all the stuff that's out there on the web, people who take the time to bring things together and present you with a selection that they think's interesting, which you might call curating if you don't hate that term, but
yeah, I'm a bit dubious about it. It's those people that collect half a dozen images on Pinterest and suddenly announce to the world that they're curators.
Yeah, well, I have some sympathy with that, obviously. But I'm thinking of a particular example at the moment is this blog called Via Negativa, run by a guy called Dave Bonter. And I've been really enjoying his weekly blog posts where he takes extracts from other people's blogs, writers' blogs. He's a poet and an editor and is involved in all kinds of creative projects. But he basically trolls blogs, poets' blogs, writers' blogs, and he includes extracts in his weekly digest. So he doesn't reblog the whole post, just a section that he's found interesting. And he lets us all know about this via Twitter, a link to the blog post, and he tags all the people that he's included. So that's how I found out about it. Once he tagged me, I had no idea. But what I really like about it is I'm now following this weekly compilation, and there's all kinds of writers' blogs that I've discovered through there, just through his little short extracts. And I just think it's a marvellous thing.
Oh, what's his name again?
His name is Dave Bonta, Bonta. This blog is
Via Negativa.
Via Negativa is the name of the blog, but he's got other blogs as well, where more focused on his own work. But yeah, fascinating. I've come across. Why it's
called Via Negativa. That comes from Saint John of the Cross, who talks about the only way to reach God is to completely abandon hope of ever glimpsing God.
Yeah, well, there you go. You're going to have to have a think about that one, eh?
I don't know. I don't understand the internet.
I don't ask difficult questions like that. I just enjoy the blog. But anyway, that's my little two pennyworth. I wanted to just give him a mention and his blog a mention, because I love this idea of somebody going to the trouble of curating a load of interesting resources for me, who doesn't really want to have to trawl through them all and discover them myself.
Who has the time to just kind of be surfing endlessly?
Well, that's right. You've been listening to an interesting podcast, I believe, recently.
Yeah, there's this podcast called the History of English podcast by Kevin Stroud. It started about 10 years ago, I think. I'm not sure where it's got to, but I've listened to 43 episodes so far, and we're just we're still discussing Beowulf, but it goes right back to the sort of Indo-European roots of language and traces all the developments of different languages and how they eventually fed into English.
Wow.
And also it's coupled with all these extraordinary kind of history lessons about these people and who they were and where they migrated to. And I'm just finding it really inspiring, learning the origins of words and come from the same roots and things.
Sounds interesting. What's it called again?
It's called the History of English podcast by Kevin Stroud, but I highly recommend it. I mean, if you're a bit of a language nerd, which, most of the people listening to this podcast are, there's so many episodes that it's endless fun once you get into it. I like the idea of suddenly understanding everyday words better, like companions, for example.
Yeah.
Is the idea of people that you break bread with. And right. Just kind of, it's sort of triggering all these kind of new ways of seeing familiar words. And Sounds good. I highly recommend that podcast.
History of English.
Even that History of English.
I was thrown there. I thought you said the History of English podcasts. And I thought, gosh, they go all the way back to Beowulf. That's interesting.
Yes.
History of English. Sounds good.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
Beowulf means bee hunter.
Oh, does it?
The name. And what is a bee hunter? A bee hunter is a bear, so it's a kind of a literary construct. And actually, there are very few people called Beowulf in reality. So it's full of little gems like that.
We're actually going to hear a performance of Beowulf in a little village hall at the end of this month with a sort of hog roast. Bring your own crumb horn or whatever. So I'm looking forward to that.
I read the Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf about 10 years ago. Very readable version, I think. I really enjoyed that. Anyway, I don't know how quite we got onto Beowulf, but...